Lee and Les Hour. This is Lee. I'm Les, and we're glad to be back together again. We've talked several times here in the auditorium. It's either Lee or Les, or it's Rodney and Stan, right? And so we are the backups that they send in. You know, when the score is so far ahead, you don't worry about losing the game. So, but we're glad to be here. And Lee, always a pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. See, am I on? There we go.
You're on.
I am
Absolutely.
on. Yeah, it's always enjoyable. You know, we shoot things back and forth throughout the week as far as, you put a PowerPoint together. I kind of come up with maybe a couple of options or things to think about and kind of respond back, and then we get up here and it all changes again.
And it changes. That's right, as we go through it. We're launching a series today. We don't know how long this is going to go. Is it going to go 13 weeks? Is it going to go 26 weeks? We don't know. Lee will be out some. I will be out some. And so we'll be tag teaming most of the time, but occasionally one or the other will take it. But it's a series called Walking on the Water with Jesus, Lessons from the Life of Simon Peter. And I don't know if you can see in the background of the slide up there, but this is from The Chosen, the last episode of season 3, of where the apostles are trying to go across the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus goes walking to them. Far right, you see Jesus over there. Over on the left, you see the boat with the apostles in it. And of course, they, in The Chosen, make this the episode of where Peter walks on the water. They got it out of order. They combined two stories together. There's actually two different stories of them being out on the sea when a storm was there and Jesus walking on the water. But anyway, great background, and so we grabbed it. And so we're going to be looking at the life of Simon, son of Jonah. Introductory lesson today. You know, Lee, I think oftentimes we think we know a lot about Peter. But I suspect we don't know near as much as we think we know. Yeah. And I'm hoping that today we can inspire you to say, hey, I want to know more about this apostle. Several years ago, a book came out by one of my favorite authors, N.T. Wright. Lee, I've been a fan of N.T. Wright now for about 20 years. But he did a biography of Paul. And I tell people today when they say, what's the best book outside the Bible you've ever read? And the answer is The Life of Paul by N.T. Wright. It is just an incredible biography, commentary on the life of Paul by one of the premier New Testament scholars in the world.
You got to, did you go to a seminar that he was at?
I have heard him several times at seminars. In fact, last summer, Stan and I we were in Texas, and he was doing a seminar on Romans, and got to see him and hear him out there. But he's just one of my favorite scholars. I love to read. He communicates in a way I understand. Lee, I don't know if you've ever read authors. Somebody will say, you got to read this book. It's the best book you've ever read in the world. And you read it and go, I don't have a clue what they're trying to say. There are authors that I don't understand what they're saying. Yeah. They write in a way that doesn't communicate with this brain, okay? And then there are other authors like N.T. Wright that I connect with immediately. Well, I've always wanted someone to do something on the life of Peter. I'm like, man, we focus so much on Paul when Peter was kind of this lead apostle, first person to preach on Pentecost, amazing individual. And so thanks for enduring us as we just kind of celebrate the life of Peter.
Yeah, I think we all recognize he's a fascinating character, but like you say, we don't always appreciate everything about him. And one of the interesting things that the author of this book, of course, he admittedly is saying, we're kind of like The Chosen at times. You're kind of filling in the gaps with some, well, this might be the case. This might be what was behind this. They don't claim it to be, that it's gospel, so to speak. But it does cause you to think. At least causes me to think. It's like, well, okay, that's plausible. Don't know for sure, but that is certainly a plausible option of what might have happened.
And you'll hear us say some of that this quarter. You'll probably go, does the Bible really say that? go back and try to read between the lines, because Lee and I are going to be doing a lot of reading between the lines. We began tonight simply with where he got his name. Simon's name is one of the oldest names in the Bible. Genesis chapter 29, he is the second son of Leah in her relationship with Jacob. And the word Simeon means in Hebrew some form of herd. And so Simeon in the Old Testament, the E drops out and it becomes Simon in the New Testament. And so you get this name. Out of curiosity, what does the name Lee mean?
Awesome.
Are you pulling my leg or telling the truth?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay. Really? Means
No.
awesome.
No, I don't know.
Oh, you don't know what it
I have
means?
no clue. I just, I look at myself and I assume that's what it means.
Okay, all right. Well,
Joan probably has a different opinion. but,
yes,
you know,
Joan would definitely have a different opinion. My full name is Leslie, and I shortened it to Les because I got tired of people thinking I was a woman. Mm-hmm. And if y'all have never experienced that, that is so frustrating. You know, you go to the doctor's office, Miss Chapman, and you're thinking, is there another Miss Chapman here, or have they misunderstood who I am? And, of course, I'll raise my hand, and they look down at the chart, and they look back at me and go, oh, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, well, you should be. You know, the entire time I was at Freed Hardeman, I was in a boys' dorm, but they had me listed as a female in my registration.
There was Freed Hardeman was more liberal than I thought.
They were far more liberal than you thought, absolutely. But Leslie, a Lee, is a meadow. And so you have Stanley. That's a large meadow. You have Wesley. That's a western meadow. And then you have Leslie, a little bitty meadow. Isn't that a great name?
I'm just a meadow.
I'm just a meadow. I've got a friend who to this day always, every time he sees me, he says, oh, little meadow. Yeah, thank you very much. But names mean stuff. And Simon got his name from one of the patriarchs of ancient Israel. And it was a very common name. Lee, I thought it was fascinating that you've got two Simons just in the apostles, two Jameses just in the apostle. And by the way, you know my name's in the apostles. Did you know that? James, the son of Alphaeus, is also called James the Less.
Yes.
Yeah, so Less is in there.
You're right.
All right. But anyway, notice Simon the Zealot, Simon who is called Peter, very common name, 9 different Simons in the New Testament alone. By the way, Jewish people did not have a large variety of names. Most of them were patriarchs, you know, someone who went before. And of course, I tell people all the time, you think of the name Jesus. Anybody tell me the Old Testament name of Jesus? What would Jesus have been called in the Old Testament? Joshua. Yeah, Yeshua. Yahweh is salvation. And so whenever I meet someone named Joshua, I go, congratulations, named after Jesus. And they go, no, I'm Joshua. And I'm like, yes, you're still named after Jesus. I mean, Joshua is the name Jesus, and Jesus is the name Joshua. Jesus is the Greek version of that, and Simon is kind of the Greek version of Simeon. We know his dad. His dad's name was either John, or in Matthew 16:17, Jesus calls him Simon Bar-Jonah. And so Jonah and John, derivatives of the same name, goes back. And when Jesus first meets Peter, he changes his name. What's going on there?
I think part of it is Jesus is he's either describing what Peter is or what Peter's going to be.
Yeah.
We think of that, Cephas, which, translated Peter, rock. I think it was in a couple of slides prior to this that, had the list of the apostles, and it said, First Peter. By that point, maybe that was Matthew's gospel, maybe that was Matthew's, but, as he's writing back, I mean, Peter, he had challenges. We know he did. He reminds us of ourselves maybe more than any other apostle at times, but he takes on a tremendous role, a leadership role within the apostles, who were all leaders in and of themselves, but he was a true leader. It's reflected in Acts. He's the one chosen to preach the first message.
So Jesus is setting him up, and he would have been called by Jesus Cephas, because that's the Aramaic name. Peter is the Greek name. Okay, both mean rock. Lee, when I was a kid, my grandfather had a nickname for me, and it kind of worked like this. My grandfather's nickname for me was preacher. I'm talking about when I was 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old. Here comes my little preacher. Here comes my little preacher. And I used to think, oh, no, I'm not, Papa. I am not your little preacher. And guess what? I became his preacher. Now, Papa died before he ever saw me be able to preach.
And still little.
And still little, too. Yeah, still a little preacher. Absolutely. All right. You don't have much to talk about there. You know, I mean, come on.
No, not a lot. Not a lot.
But I think you're right. Calling him the rock was a setup for who he would be. Old Testament, name changes. What's God doing here?
Yeah, he's basically setting them. He's already set apart, but now he's really setting apart. So this is not only is this going to be your name change, but this is what's involved with that. I mean, Abraham, father of many nations. I mean,
he don't even have a child. Well,
no,
he didn't have a child yet.
No.
And yet God's calling him father of many nations.
And still isn't going to have a child for
long
quite some
time.
And of course, we know there's times where both he and his wife tried to help God, okay, I guess this is going to be your child. And it's not, no. God says, no, I've got a plan, just be patient. So he sets it up there. I think you've got maybe the next slide as well.
Next one is Jacob.
Jacob, his name's no longer going to be Jacob, but it's going to be Israel. Why? You've struggled with God, with humans, and overcome. And I mean, if the Hebrew people, they had struggles. They overcame. Now they overcame with God's help. Again, God's time is not always our time. I mean, you think about, he was going to make them his people were going to be a great nation. His son's going to be a great nation. And yet, how many years before they were able to become how long they were in Egypt?
Over 400 years.
400 years. Yeah. And still waiting on that promise. And it kind of seems as though once Moses goes, the people really aren't that, they're not exactly welcoming.
Yeah.
With like, oh, here's our leader out of this. I mean, they really weren't enamored with what he was doing, at least not at first.
Not at first, yeah. Again, name changes are important. Israel, El means God, struggled with God. Jacob, on the other hand, I love kidding people. Anybody in here named James? Any guys in here named James? Do we have any Jameses in here? We don't. This is unusual. No Jameses?
Nobody's going to admit to it until they hear what you say.
By the way, James is Jacob. That's your Greek name of Jacob. And of course, Jacob is named Jacob because when he's born, he's grabbing the heel of his twin brother Esau, which to grab the heel means to trip, to cause to fall, to stumble, and eventually to deceive. And so the name Jacob means the deceiver, the one who causes someone to fall. And by the way, we remember that one of Jacob's roles when he went in to steal his father's blessing was to dress up like his brother Esau to play the role of the deceiver. Yep. And he deceived, and he got deceived, and then God said, it's time for a name change.
Yeah, it was his life was kind of the epitome of what goes around comes around.
Yes, absolutely. And again, as Americans, we're not into meanings of names. We don't name our kids something that's, got a lot of meaning to it. June and I, when we named our boys, I don't know how y'all named y'all's kids, but we named our boys by what names sounded good together. And so my middle name is Scott, and so I wanted to give my oldest son the name Scott, and then I began to find a name that would go with Scott. And so June and I just started going through names. Lee Scott. No, not Lee Scott. Yeah. I definitely wasn't going to name him Leslie. And we ended up finally going with Robert Scott. And we thought, well, that sounds good. And we did that with both of our boys. How did y'all pick names?
Well, I did a lot of research, looked at a lot of things, and I said, Joan, what do you want to name them? And just left it at that.
So Joan named the kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gary, if I remember right, we just liked the name Gary. She likes the name, and if you say it with a Scottish accent, it rolls off the tongue.
Okay.
It's like Gary. It's just people when Joe might say Gary, people aren't always hearing Gary; they're hearing something else. But then Lee was just kind of named after me, the middle name. I didn't want him, didn't want a junior or anything like that. Just the girls were. I liked the name Siobhan. I love the name. I just thought that was, it's a very not a very normal sounding name here, but it's used a little bit more over in Scotland, and I just really loved that name, and so we called her Siobhan. Then Elizabeth is her middle name, but turns out after they were born and after they had their names, and of course Kaylee is our other daughter. She would have been maybe Kylie, but that was around the time someone, an actress and a singer by the name of Kylie Minogue, had gotten extremely popular over in Britain, and was like, no, we don't want to name her after this person. We're going to name her Kaylee. But Siobhan, we found out later on, it's Irish Gaelic.
Okay.
And it turns out it's Irish Gaelic for Joan. So we actually ended up naming her after Joan, not realizing that's what we were doing.
Wow, neat. My dad, by the way, his name was Lee. So Good man. Simon, Cephas, or Peter. Here's something I did not know, and when I saw it, Lee, I thought, wow. Simon, Cephas, or Peter occurs 181 times in the New Testament, whereas Paul or Saul is only mentioned 177 times. I would have told anybody, if you had asked me whose name other than Jesus is mentioned more than anybody else in the New Testament, I would have told you Paul in a heartbeat. I mean, he wrote so much, the book of Acts, so much is about him, but no, the Gospels really puts Peter over the top because of how many times he's listed there. He is from Bethsaida. Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. By the way, anytime you see B-E-T-H on a name, it means house. Bethlehem, house of bread. Bethsaida is house of fish. And so this obviously lets us know a little bit about the town being called the house of fish. Here's a map of the Sea of Galilee. And you see Capernaum way over here on the left. Bethsaida, we don't know exactly where Bethsaida is. Stan says a new archaeological discovery about last month or so puts it down closer to the edge of the lake. Others thought it was about a mile up and that it all filled in.
Okay.
It is silted in over time. And so we don't know. I don't know that we know 100%. And let's face it, I grew up in Ripley, Mississippi. I moved to Covington, Tennessee. Anybody know the town right above Covington, Tennessee? Ripley, Tennessee. And so when I moved to Covington, and people would say, where are you from? Ripley? Oh, just up the road. No, down across the state line. I mean, and by the way, when I was a teenager, my preacher left Ripley, Mississippi and moved to Ripley, Tennessee. And he moved from the Ripley Church of Christ here to preach at the Ripley Church of Christ there. And so, you know, you could have had multiple Bethsaidas.
That way
House of Fish.
He didn't have to change any of his name stuff.
All of
name
his
tag,
business
all his
cards,
business card.
all of his business cards stayed the same. And so, and by the way, Capernaum over to Bethsaida, maybe 5 miles. This is not very far at all. I mean, y'all think about walking from here to, say, Rivergate. You get a picture of maybe how far it is. Of course, you got to walk around the sea there. And by the way, he was partners in fishing, he and Andrew, with James and John. What role did fishing play in Galilee at this time?
Yeah, it was huge. I mean, it was a huge part of livelihood. You know, it wasn't necessarily one where you were going to make a lot of money. You know, but it was one where it was basically allowed you to at least have a lifestyle or a livelihood that was going to provide. You know, it may not provide an awful lot, but it would provide because fish was such a huge part of the diet, you know, of the people there. It was hard work. I mean, it was not. I think we've got some slides here in a little bit.
Yeah,
to
and
kind
it
of
was
show some of that.
mostly done at night.
Yeah.
I mean, this was you'd go out and work until late into the night, and then come in. I mean, multiple times in the New Testament, Jesus would be there, and they say, "Lord, we fished all night and haven't caught anything." Mm-hmm. And so, night fishing was the primary way. And so, imagine guys who are fishing at night, and they're sleeping in the day, and their families have got to be quiet. You know, dad's asleep. You know, because he's got to go back to work tonight. People with a night shift way back then as well.
Yeah.
By the way, notice they're in partners with James and John, and they also hired people that work with them. In other words, it's not just 2 guys in a boat.
No.
They've got crews. Zebedee's got people he hires. We don't know how many boats they had, but they could have had several boats. In the Chosen, they show them as having, several boats and their business going on. And so it was a very important business. Now, in Jerusalem to this day, there's the fish gate. If you go to Jerusalem, it's called the fish gate. Now, is this where the original fish gate is? We don't know, because Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. But we do know, going all the way back to the times of Nehemiah, there was a gate called the fish gate. And most of the study I read on that simply said it was because that's where fish would be imported from Galilee and sold. Yeah. And so not only did you have people who were catching the fish, you had people who were curing the fish, and then you had people who were transferring and selling the fish in places like Jerusalem. Yeah. And so big business in Jerusalem. And by the way they would cure the fish is by drying it. Drying it or salting it. We've gotten away from that. Any experience killing hogs when you were growing up? No. Lee, you were raised in the countryside of Antioch. Okay, yeah. Not a lot of hog killing in Antioch. No. Where I was raised, we still kill hogs. And so the day after Thanksgiving, we would kill the hogs. We'd go out to my grandmother's, and grandmother would kill 2. Her and granddaddy we'd kill them, but they would have 2 hogs killed. We would have 2 hogs killed. My aunts and uncles would have 1 or 2 hogs killed. I mean, we'd killed oftentimes 12, 15 hogs in one day. And of course, you kill the hogs, and you cut them up, and you boil out the lard. If you've ever been to a hog killing, it's a lot of hard work. My job was scraping the hair off the hogs. Loved doing that.
I bet.
It was fun. and you would finish up, and of course, you would take the meat and you would either smoke it, dry it, or we would salt cure it. And we would just cover it in salt. I mean, I don't know how many bags and bags and bags of salt we would buy. And they would leave it in the salt for like a week, take it out, wrap it up, and then hang it. And it would last the rest of the year outside. And I've seen my grandmother many a time, Lee, bring in a ham cured by salt only, and as she's slicing it, she would eat it right off I didn't even cook it. And I'd look at her and go, "You're eating raw ham?" And she said, "It's cured." And in the ancient world, that's the way everybody ate it.
Yeah.
I mean, the fish would have been salted, and they would have hung it like this. By the way, Mary Magdalene. Mary is from Magdala. Okay? Magdala. Magdala is a village south of Capernaum, and Magdala means tower. It was a fish tower. It was a tower that they would dry literally thousands and thousands of fish on and then take to Jerusalem to sell. So imagine this business. By the way, here's a recreation drawing of ancient Capernaum. The houses were all connected in the ancient world. You didn't buy a standalone house unless you had a lot of property. And there were multiple reasons for this, Lee. I mean, think about what happens in the wintertime when you've got plenty of houses all built together.
Yeah.
Much easier to stay warm, much easier to be protected. Most families lived in compounds. Out of curiosity, how far did you live from your grandparents?
About 50 miles.
Okay, so it was a little piece.
A little bit, yeah. It was down Lewisburg
Okay,
area.
okay.
Lewisburg, which was near Cornersville, which was near Ostella, which is where my mom's parents were.
You know, my grandparents had a large farm. And when I was a kid, I'd go out to my grandparents because grandmother and granddaddy lived here. My Uncle Hank lived here. My Uncle Sterrett lived there. I mean, they all lived on the family farm. That's the way the ancient world was, except they all lived in the same building. When you got engaged to get married, your job was to build a room onto the house. And by the way, y'all see what the building material is here? Have you been to Israel?
I have not.
You have not. I told June. June's never been to Israel. And I told June, one of the things you'll find in Israel is that they have a lot of is rocks. Y'all, rocks are everywhere. Rocks, and then there's more rocks, and then there's more rocks. Basically, the old saying is that when God gave the angel the responsibility for spreading the rocks around the world, when he got over Israel, a hole tore in his bag. And most of it fell in Israel. I mean, you go over there and you look at the countryside and you go, how in the world did they farm this? They had to dig up the rocks, and they used the rocks to build their houses. Only problem is, in war, it all gets torn down. Yeah. And oftentimes, but notice up on top, you've got fish drying. I love whoever painted this, put a cat up there. A guard cat guarding the fish. All right? You know that's not going to happen. But they would dry the fish. You see the boats being painted. And by the way, very, very realistic in the sense of that is what the Sea of Galilee looks like. It's quite amazing. Here's the kind of boats they would have fished in. This is called the Jesus boat. About 20 years ago, there was a drought in northern Israel. The Sea of Galilee fell real low. They saw this sticking up out of the mud. Huge effort to recover it. This boat dates back to the time of Jesus. Obviously, we have no clue if Jesus ever rode in it, but it dates to the time of Jesus, and it helped them because and Lee, man, they brought in experts from all around the world because once it was exposed to air, that wood was going to disintegrate fast.
Yep.
And they did a massive archaeological work to get that and preserve it. And it's been totally preserved. There's what it would have actually looked like. And so if you've ever wondered, what did the boats that Jesus and the apostles fished in, what did they look like? That's one right there. Fairly long boat. You can get 12, 13 guys in this boat. You'd have nets. You'd have oars. You notice two different sizes. And then you'd have sails. And so you could go out, you could fish at night, you could oar around, you could have several in there. Now, if you were fishing, maybe 2, maybe 4 at the most, because of trying to throw the nets.
Yeah.
They didn't do rod and reel fishing.
No.
I mean, they would basically drop these large nets. And you know, Lee, you think about that. I've never done a lot of fishing, but I can imagine it's a very tedious job just keeping your nets where they would work.
Yeah, and just and thinking, okay, is it going to be this? Is this the right spot?
Yeah.
Or should I have been half a mile over here? You know, I mean, it had to be somewhat of a hit and miss situation. And then sometimes you would even be in a place that had been, you know, this had been a good spot before. Well, then all of a sudden it's not anymore, and you got to find somewhere different. And of course, that all comes into play with trying to not just provide for your families, but also having to, because they didn't get to do this without having to pay for.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that, just the sheer number of taxes they had to pay. And so, huge business, big deal back then. And Jesus left the synagogue, went to the home of Simon. This is in Capernaum. Peter, Philip, Andrew, James, John, well, not James, John, but Philip, Peter, and Andrew were from Bethsaida. But at some point in time, Peter moved to Capernaum, about 5 miles away, another fishing village. I've got a guess as to why he did that, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But he bought a house. His mother-in-law is living there, not far from the synagogue. Notice here, Jesus left the synagogue and went to Simon Peter's house. How far? Watch the picture. This is ancient Capernaum. Okay? This is an overhead shot. There's the Sea of Galilee. Right here is the ancient synagogue. Okay? And by the way, this was not the synagogue in Jesus' day. The synagogue in Jesus' day was underneath it. In other words, the synagogue got destroyed during the Jewish war. They rebuilt it many years later, but they found the foundation of the synagogue down here. You see down at the very bottom, you can see some black rock at the foundation. That's black basalt rock, which was a part of the synagogue of Jesus' day. All right. Notice right here that building, it looks like a spaceship. That's a Catholic church built over what they think is Peter's house. They were doing excavations there. They came across a mosaic on the floor of this house. It was a Christian mosaic claiming it was the house of Simon Peter. So, now, 100% sure? No. But this mosaic dates back 1,600 years ago, maybe 1,700 years ago. And so, it's now covered. You can go into the church and look down and see the ruins. Now, honestly, the ruins look like this right here. And these rocks are everywhere over there. Now notice, you come out of the synagogue, how far is it to the house? It's from here to the foyer back there. Okay? That's how close everything was. I tell people Capernaum was probably the size of the block Hendersonville occupies. Okay? If you go over here to Imperial Square, go all the way over here to the manor, that would have been the size of Capernaum. It's just all the houses are close together. I've seen guesstimates, Lee. I don't know how valid. 1,500 people maybe lived there in Jesus' day. Obviously, when Jesus got there, many more thousands poured in because of who Jesus was. But this is Capernaum. This is the synagogue, and here is one of the most important things I want you to see. This is called the Via Maris. Okay, the Via Maris, Latin for the way of the sea. And what this is an ancient highway. Goes from Cairo, Egypt, up through what today is, and my brain just left me, where the Palestinians still control
Lebanon.
It. Not Lebanon, way down in the south. I'm sorry? It's where Philip went, because the eunuch was on the way to Gaza. Thank you, Miss Julia. Always gets double jeopardy. Always. Yeah. Thank you, Miss Julia. Gaza is down here. This goes up through Gaza, up the coast, and then once it gets to Haifa, which Haifa is ancient Joppa, where Jonah went to escape, it cuts across And notice where it goes. It goes to Tiberias, which is on the Sea of Galilee, and then goes straight up the Sea of Galilee, and guess what village it goes through? Capernaum. Now you say, okay, what's the big deal about that? Y'all, this was the ancient I-40. This is how you traveled from Memphis to Knoxville. This is how you travel. By the way, I don't know how far I-40 goes west, but it goes a long way.
It goes at least to Vegas. I think.
I know it goes through Oklahoma
Maybe
City,
beyond.
it goes through North
They go
Texas.
to California. But
I-40 is a long way. The Via Morris was a long way. And by the way, it went up to Damascus, and then it kept going through down into ancient Persia and modern-day Iraq and those areas along the Tigris-Euphrates. That road passed right through Capernaum. And so right on the edge of the road, they built a Buc-ee's. Oh, come on. Y'all know what a Buc-ee's is, right? Y'all hadn't heard of Buc-ee's? Oh, man. That joke fell flat.
no, you know, sometimes.
Now, here's a Buc-ee's right there. Okay. The Kings have been to Buc-ee's. Buc-ee's is the largest gas station in America. And they just finished the biggest one in right outside Gatlinburg, right outside of Sevierville.
Yeah.
They got one in Crossville. If you've never been to a Buc-ee's, I mean, you go in, and if you go down here to the racetrack, there's like 12 gas stations. You go to Buc-ee's, there's 120 gas stations. Largest rest stop I've ever seen. You can buy food, you can get everything. That's what Capernaum was. It was a rest stop. It's where all of these caravans heading toward Egypt or heading toward Damascus, guess where they stopped to buy food? Capernaum. Guess where they stopped to sell goods? Capernaum. And so Capernaum wasn't just this fishing village, it was on a major highway, which also made it necessary for this. Talk about this, if you would, Lee.
Yeah, so it says, once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him. He began to teach them. And as he's walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. He says, follow me. Jesus told him. Levi gets up and follows him. Tax collecting. There was a bundle of taxes that people had to pay. And there were all sorts of different taxes involved just with the fishing industry. And also just depending on the region you're in, and if you're right beside this region and you're going to another region, well, there's another tax you've got to go through that region. I mean, it was one after another.
Yeah, the Romans taxed heavily. Now, the fishing business, I thought this was fascinating. They have discovered piers out there that they say there's no way the ordinary people would have built them, and that most likely these piers had been built by the government. By the way, anybody remember, here, Miss Julia, pull this one out of your hat. All right, you ready? Who governed Galilee and specifically Capernaum? Who was the king? See how good y'all are. I'll help you out. He was one of Herod's sons. And he's the one that got in trouble with John the Baptist. Herod Antipas. Okay? Herod Antipas. And Lee was talking. I want you to look at all the purple. The purple is Herod Antipas territory. Okay? Herod the Great dies. He gives his 2 sons, or he actually gave 4 sons property. They were all tetrarchs, which means 4 rulers. But Antipas got Galilee and Perea. They weren't even linked. Samaria and Judea went to Archelaus, but Archelaus was such a jerk, the Romans pulled him out and put a Roman governor over it. And then you had Batanea up here to the north, that brown up there. Notice Bethsaida, way up here in the top. Bethsaida is in Batanea, is in this region, governed by Philip, which is, by the way, Antipas's brother. Here's where Antipas is governing. His capital is Sepphoris, right over here. You pay taxes to them. they paid taxes to then Rome. And so, it's like we pay into the state of Tennessee. The state of Tennessee would then pay it to Washington. That's how the taxes were collected. And evidence shows that Antipas had built these big piers all along the Sea of Galilee for the fishing industry. But in order to use the pier, guess what you had to do? You had to buy rental property. In other words, you had, it's kind of like, anybody live on Old Hickory Lake and you rent from the Corps of Engineers, I mean, if you live on the lake up there, you don't own the land by the lake. Land by the lake's owned by the Corps of Engineers. And you just don't go down there and build a dock down there. You do, the Corps of Engineers will come give you a ticket and tear it down. I mean, you have to go through the Corps to get permission and all that kind of stuff. That was the way the ancient world was. And so Peter and Andrew and James and John, they're paying taxes on what they catch and sell. They're paying taxes on the ability to use the docks where their ships are going out. I mean, you're paying taxes all the time. And, Lee, as you said, if you're traveling from this side over to this side in a caravan, you got to pay taxes there. Yeah. So you're paying taxes everywhere, which is why they were so bitter. The Jews are like, you're taxing us to death, and they were. And that's why Matthew had such a good business. Yeah. And in The Chosen, Lee, they show Matthew and Peter and John and them knowing one another. I never thought about that until I saw The Chosen. But now I'm convinced they probably did know each other.
They would have interacted so often with.
And I can see, in The Chosen, when Jesus calls Matthew, Peter goes, "Oh no, Lord, not him."
Yeah.
And he says there, and he says, "Lord, he's different." Anybody remember what the character Jesus says in the Chosen when Peter says he's different or this is different? He said, "Get used to different." Beautiful one-liner. Y'all are going, you've watched too much of The Chosen, yeah? By the way, Chosen's becoming like Andy Griffith. I mean, I don't know about you, but I can quote a lot of lines of Barney on Andy Griffith, And so this is where they would have been. Now, here's the thing, and we don't have but about 3 minutes, Lee, so I want to hit this one just briefly. Most people get confused here because they read Matthew and they think of Jesus calling them in Matthew. And here's the text. And so, what's the problem? This is where he actually performs a miracle. It's much more detailed in Mark than it is over in Matthew. But in Matthew's account, Jesus walks around the shore and just says to Peter and Andrew, "Follow me." And they get up as if,
I think in maybe the email I sent you back, it's like, this is not, it wasn't like they were mindless zombies.
Yeah.
And that Jesus calls and they're like, oh, and they're just kind of almost following that way. I mean, there was a much more of a backstory to what acts, where they really, the reason he can call them and they respond the way they do is because of what happened previously.
Yeah. And of course, this is the early story of where Jesus does the miraculous catch of fish. I love this miraculous catch. I mean, this is just one of my favorite parts. But this is not the backstory, like you said. If you think Jesus walks along, follow me, and they drop everything and follow Jesus, and they've never met him, you've not read the story. You've got to read the rest of the story. And we don't have time to touch it except briefly, but this is the background, and then we'll pick up here next week. So John comes preparing the way, and what's the response, of everybody?
Yeah, people are being baptized. They're responding to John's message, and of course he's pointing to somebody else, and the people are following John, but they're also know he's heading them in another direction, because he says, because at one time they even asked, "Are you
the Christ?
Are you the Christ?" He says, "No."
Yeah.
He says, "I'm preparing the way," and so people like Andrew and others, they've been listening to John, and they're his, they're still working, but they're also his disciples as far as listening to what he's teaching and trying to, I guess, get ready for who John says is coming.
And so let me ask you this. They leave Galilee. They go down to the Jordan River. They're baptized by John, and they're hanging around down there. What does that tell us about their expectations of the coming Messiah?
Yeah, I mean, it's happening, but they're looking for something. A, they're looking for something right away. B, they're looking for something that's not really what Jesus has in mind, which is not surprising.
Right. That was the expectations they'd been taught.
Everybody for hundreds of years, what they're looking for is a Messiah that is going to restore Israel to its former glory, as far as a nation is concerned. And it's going to take them a while to figure out that's not the case.
Yeah. All right, so picture the scene. Peter, Andrew, James, and John are up in Galilee. They're fishing. Rumors start coming up into Galilee of this strange preacher down in Judea. He's wearing strange clothes, he's eating strange food, and he's preaching a fiery message. They go down there along with, look at this, people went out to him from Jerusalem, all Judea, and the whole region of the Jordan, which takes you all the way up to Galilee. They're going down there to hear this strange preacher. And John the Baptist baptizes Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Nathaniel. These guys become disciples of John. And then Jesus shows up, and we'll pick up with that next week. How about dismissing us in prayer?
Sure. God, we do thank you for this day, and we thank you for the blessings that you provide to us each and every day. We ask that you help us to always honor and glorify you in the things that we do, things that we say, that you will help us to be a light to those around us. We look forward to our time of learning more of the life of Peter, of the challenges that he faced, the mistakes that he made, but how he continually, because of his trust and confidence in you, overcame those mistakes and became the person that he was, and one of the great leaders of the early church. We ask you to be with us as we leave from here today, that you will take us safely to our various destinations. And again, we ask you to be with us throughout this week, that we will, again, look to you for direction, that we will look to you for strength in whatever we may be dealing with, and that you will, again, help us to be that light that you need us to be in order to make a difference in this world. We thank you that you forgive us of our sins, and it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. God bless y'all. Y'all have a great day.